Hey, thanks so much for checking out episode number 5 of the Selah Leaders Podcast. Before we get too far, if you are enjoying this content, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, send it to your grandma, your cousin, your next door neighbor. I don't know who you send stuff to. Maybe it's a pastor friend or a leader friend in your life. Send this out to them. It's going to be a great encouragement today. I've got my friend and podcast guide, Darren Zook, in the house.
What's going on, everybody? It's good to be with you today and unpacking episode number 5. I almost made that awkward.
You almost did.
I almost did.
And I mean, when I say in the house, literally in the house, because we're at Darren's house. That's where we film these podcasts. But super excited because we are kind of in the middle of a conversation. First episode we've done like this. Really glad we did this in 2 parts.
Yeah.
Initially, this was going to be 1, and I was like, man, I'm a preacher. I'm kind of long-winded. I think I will bump the clock on this, and so we broke it out into 2 episodes, and that's really good because as we look at this last episode, we talked about the first 2 enemies of rest, because we're talking about the 4 enemies of rest. The first 2 was living a hurried life and anxiousness. Those things keep us from rest. And the reason why, when we talk about this thing being called Selah Leaders, the Selah Leaders podcast, Selah would be a term that would kind of be deposited at the end of a psalm. It was a pause. It was a break. It was a breath. It was a moment where you didn't want to pass too quickly. Yeah. And that's what we really value. That's what we want to help create in people's lives, because that's what God designed you for. He designed you to rest. And that's part of God's perfect design. Genesis 1 and 2, God rests. We don't have to rest because of the fall. We don't have to rest because sin entered into the world. We rest because it's God's design for our life. And one of the things that I love to say about rest is that rest is trust. Because rest is trusting God to take care of the world without you.
Yeah.
He's been doing this a long time. And sometimes if we're not careful, we don't rest because we feel like we have to be engaged, we have to be ready, we have to be available. Like if we just worked a little bit harder or a little bit longer, or if we just kind of hey, I know I plan to take the day off, but right now I've got to be doing this, I got to be doing that. Typically, those are moments where what we're really saying is, hey, God, I don't trust you to handle this situation without me. And God's way bigger than we are. Yeah. And so as we look at rest today, we're going to unpack 2 more components of things that stand in the way of us resting. Yeah. And the first one that we're going to unpack is team conflict. Listen. Team conflict can keep you from rest. But there's always team conflict. Yeah. Because this is a leadership podcast, and if you're a leader, you have followers, and if you have followers, they are people, and if you have people, they are messy, and in their mess, you will have conflict.
Very true.
Darren knows. Yeah. Right? Yeah. We've dealt with in the last month, we've dealt with a ton of conflict. Not sometimes when we think of conflict, we think of person to person conflict. Yeah. Of 2 people who are fighting and arguing, and that happens. Yeah. Right? You do have people sometimes that butt heads, or you have a big personality that enters into the room. But that's not always what team conflict is. Yeah. Sometimes team conflict is just dealing with the messiness of people's lives. Yeah. Because in the way that we lead in ministry, where we're caring for people's souls and things like that.
Yeah. And I think also too, just in the last season, we've seen a lot of conflict that's happening in the spiritual realm. You know, we talk a lot about spiritual warfare, and that conflict too is something that you may be facing, you know, when you're ultimately leading your team, and they're going to be experiencing spiritual warfare when you may not be, and you're going to be experiencing it when they may not be.
Yeah. Well, and as a leader, you will always feel it first.
Yeah.
You'll always feel the weight of it first. I know that, like, there have been times in my leadership when I've come to our team and been like, man, this season feels heavy, and no one feels it then. Give it 2 weeks. Yeah. Give it a little bit of time.
It's coming, believe me. Yeah.
It's coming. And so I think, like, as a leader, we just have to know that team conflict, one of the lies I believed early in leadership was that team conflict at some point just goes away.
Yeah.
Like, if you build a good enough team, or you get the right people on the bus, if you get everybody in the right position, then at some point you won't have conflict anymore. And that's just not true. Like, I remember in the early days, I would like lose sleep thinking about solutions on how to fix problems with people. Like, I would experience chaos, I would experience team conflict, something would go wrong, and then I would find myself staying awake all night, robbing myself of physical rest,
right,
going, oh my gosh, well, if I just do this, and this, and if I have these 7 conversations with people, if I can fine tune this conversation, and I'd be laying in bed having an argument between me and another person that's not a real scenario yet, and I lose. You ever lost an argument? You ever lost an argument with yourself?
Yeah.
And a hypothetical person? And then you get to that conversation and it went nothing like what you had prepared. Right. And so I was sitting, I'll never forget this. I was actually in one of those seasons. It was right before we planted the church. I was losing sleep, and Tori and I were in Las Vegas because I was speaking at a church out there. And it was some of our overseers, Pastor Joe and Danielle Pena. And we went to the church LV the night before, and I don't remember the name of the person who was teaching, but she said, rehearsing your circumstances over and over will never give you the ability to overcome it. And I was like, that's why I flew to Vegas. Like, that's what I was here for, because if I'm not careful, will spend tons of time rehearsing my circumstances and just talking through the same situation over and over. And it never empowers me to overcome it.
So true.
And those sleepless nights are just wasted.
Yeah.
There is always going to be conflict in teams because you're dealing with people.
Yeah.
So, like, one of the things I've seen is that once I get over conflict with one person, something else happens with another. It just kind of bounces. So be aware of that. Leader, if you're expecting that you're going to be able to be a leader that doesn't have problems on their team, know that it's not true. And the reason why we know it's not true is because the only perfect person who ever walked this planet built a team full of people who had tons of problems.
Yeah, quite a few.
Jesus' inner circle.
Yep.
Tons of team conflict.
Yep.
Jesus had people who were doubting him. Jesus had people who were betraying him. Ultimately, he knew somebody was going to deny him. And these are the people he's sending out to do ministry on his behalf.
Right.
It's also the people he leaves behind to go rest and spend time with the Father.
Yeah.
It could have robbed him of rest, but it doesn't. Jesus chooses to look past those moments and kind of see that team conflict is part of the journey.
Right.
And so the way that I think about team conflict, I think about sleepless nights and I think about endless fights.
Yeah.
Right. Sometimes with team conflict, it feels like it's never ending. And this is not going to be an encouraging word for you, but I want you to look at me, look right into the camera, look into my big old blue eyes. Hear me say this: you will never get past having conflict on teams. Because you have people.
Yeah.
Jesus is on your side, but he doesn't sit at every seat on your table. You can operate in great unity. You can be a team that's moving in the same direction, and you will have conflict over something because it's just part of the game. So don't let it rob you of rest in these seasons. The best way to approach it and not let it rob you of rest is to realize it's part of the process.
Yeah.
It's part of your development. Coaching people, they're not inconveniences. Like, they have problems. And listen, just like Jesus knew Peter would deny him before he ever called him to be a disciple, you need to know that when you pick the leaders to sit at your table, they will have problems.
Yeah.
But you chose them anyways.
Right.
And not only did you choose them, here's I'll just share a really quick revelation that's been great for me in this last season. There have been times where I've been frustrated with our team, and I have to remember the team I'm frustrated with is the team that another pastor is praying for. He's praying he had. Yeah. He wishes he had. He would give his right arm to have the team that I have.
Yeah.
And yet, if I spend all of my time, I will devalue the very gift that God has blessed me with.
So good. And I think one of the things too that I often think about is when you're surrounding yourself and you're building a team around you, they all come in with their different expectations, their different upbringings. And actually expectations, I think, is a good one to kind of lean in on too, because the reality of it is that we all have expectations of what we think things should look like. And the reality of it is that very rarely does it actually get to the point that we think it should ultimately, the end goal should result, or end result should look like.
Yeah.
And so I think, from that standpoint, we talk about it all the time. Churches are filled with imperfect people.
100%.
Businesses are filled with imperfect people. Yeah. You're never going to find the perfect group of people. So what you need to do is start leaning into the people that God's given you.
Yeah. It's so good, man. And it's really true, because at the end of the day, you're not a leader unless you have followers.
Yeah, that's true.
You're not. And so in order to have followers, you're going to have imperfect people. Don't let team conflict rob you of rest. And the last area or thing that I think robs us of rest, so we talked about 3 out of 4. We talked about living a hurried life. We talked about anxiousness. We talked about team conflict. The last one for me that has robbed me of rest is what I call paralysis. There are often times in leadership where I find myself feeling stuck and not knowing what to do next. And sometimes when you feel the inability to move forward, you start to drop the habits of what you know you should be doing right now. It's crazy how fast paralysis can lead you to the place where you no longer do the things you used to do without even thinking about it.
Yeah.
I've noticed for me in a season of paralysis, when I feel stuck, my daily time with the Lord, it just disappears. It's well, I know I should be doing that, but I feel so stuck I don't know what to do. And there are times in leadership when you're leading, especially if you're leading into unknown territory, where you are going, I don't feel like I feel paralyzed.
Yeah.
I feel like I can't move backwards. I can't move forward. Can't go to my right or to my left. I don't have enough resources to take the next step. I just don't know what to do.
Yeah.
And when I don't know what to do, sometimes internally, it just kind of robs me of rest. And so if you're a leader and you're listening to this and you feel stuck in this season, I just want to encourage you, not only to not let it rob you of rest, but I'm going to give you a couple really practical things of what to do when you feel paralyzed. The first thing is to realize that God is for you.
Yeah.
And he's on your side.
Yeah.
Before Jesus left and he ascended to the Father, he gives the promise, I'm going to send the Comforter. You're going to have the Spirit. It's going to be awesome. Please wait to do ministry until you receive the Spirit, because ministry without the Spirit will be taxing and fruitless. So wait. You have no power without the Spirit.
Yeah.
We get to Acts 2, but before Jesus leaves, he says, and I'll be with you even through the end of the age. And so I think for the disciples, they're going to get to the season later on when they have the power of the Spirit, but you can have the power of the Spirit and still feel uncertain in the season that you're in.
Yeah.
So what do? We remember God's with us.
Yeah.
He hasn't left us.
Yeah.
He's still there. And the second thing we do in those seasons is when I feel stuck, I just go back and do the last thing God told me to do.
Yeah.
I've found that paralysis is typically a result of delayed obedience. God gave me clear instructions. He told me what to do, and I decided to do something else. Or I felt like maybe that's a word for down the road. I know I need to, Lord, you've given me clear instructions on removing this team member, but I don't have the replacement for them yet. I don't have the right person. I don't know who's going to step into that role. I know there's all these things that need to get done, but I don't know how they're going to get done. And so once I get the plan figured out, I'll be obedient.
Right.
But delayed obedience is disobedience.
Right.
If he said to do it, he didn't say, wait till you feel ready to do it.
Yeah.
He said, step.
Yeah.
He said, do it. And I've found that in paralysis seasons, if I'll go back and do the last thing God told me to do, I will begin to see that lamp unto my feet and that light to my path again.
That's good.
I'll be able to see kind of the Red Sea begin to part, and I'll get so much clarity because I don't think God will reveal what's next until you're faithful right now.
Yeah.
He's not going to give you, like, God has given me great dreams and visions of the future. I keep coming back to the Lord. I seek after him in those things. When we're talking about strategy and game plan in the here and now, if I'm not faithful with what he's given me for here,
Right.
I will not get there.
Right.
Because it's ultimately his end destination. Obedience is just me following the train tracks that God has led me to the place he wants me to end up. If I choose not to walk on that track, that's on me.
Yeah.
And so paralysis, I think, comes from a result of derailment. It comes from a result of getting off God's tracks, of going, you know what, like maybe I know better, or I know the Lord told me to handle the situation this way. I just didn't know if that was bad pizza or if that was the Holy Spirit. But when I operate in the Spirit and I choose to be obedient, and I choose to do what God is telling me to do, that's where I not only find fruit, but I escape paralysis. I break the bondage of the enemy that would keep me stuck in the season that God has. And typically, when I'm obedient, with great risk, there is release.
Yeah.
Like if I'm unwilling to risk, God will not release.
Yeah.
But if I'm willing to risk, God releases. He pours out. He does amazing things. And so those are the four, for me, those have been the four enemies of rest that I've found. Typically, when I feel paralyzed and I feel stuck, I don't rest because I'm trying to figure out what to do.
Yeah.
It's really simple. Just go back and do what you were supposed to do.
Yeah.
The last thing God told you. But the four enemies being hurried life, anxiousness, team conflict, and paralysis.
Yeah, man, that's so good. And I think one of the things that really stuck out as you were talking there for me was, don't step into ministry until you feel that call from the Spirit. And I think that's something that, I've seen, I think we've all seen, that some leaders have made that mistake over time. And one of the things you risk in that is you risk being stuck in that paralyzed state because, you weren't necessarily waiting on that calling from God. You weren't waiting on his Spirit. You were going to go and charge forward and do it yourself.
Yeah.
And so then you become stuck in that paralysis. And so the encouragement there is to stop and wait and listen for the Spirit of God to come over you and to let you call you into ministry and call you into what is next for you in that season.
Yeah. And when we say like calling to ministry, our next episode is all on calling.
Yeah.
Because I think we get this idea of calling all jacked up. At the end of the day, if you're a believer, every single one of us are called into ministry. It's this vocational side of ministry where it has to be from the Lord. If you're looking to get into vocational ministry because you think it's going to be easy, because you think it's going to be a break from the corporate world, if you think that it's going to give you better hours or more flexibility, that ain't the case.
Yeah.
I have a very flexible schedule, but at the drop of a hat, you don't clock in and clock out in ministry.
It can get crazy
in
quick.
Vocational ministry.
Yeah.
And so yeah, man, I think as we focus on, we don't focus on the enemy.
Yeah.
We focus on the result. How do we get through a hurried life? We focus on the fact that Jesus was always busy, but he was never in a hurry.
That's right.
How do we get over anxiousness? We surrender it to the feet of the Lord. How do we deal with team conflict? We realize it's part of the journey.
Yeah.
How do we deal with paralysis? We walk in obedience
Come on.
to do what God's called us to do.
Yeah, so good. That's so good. Well, as always, we get to that part of each episode where we get to take questions specifically from you. And so, as always, you can drop them in our comments section if you're joining us on YouTube. And if you're joining us, and you're listening via any of the different podcasting platforms that are out there, you can always drop us an email, info@selahleaders.com. But this week's question comes to us from Samantha, and she asks, how do you keep a team focused during busy seasons?
That's a great question. I think you've got to give people a target. So one of the things Andy Stanley says is, and he said this, I don't know, maybe a decade ago, if you never give people a target, they'll miss every time. You got to you got to give clarity to what is a bullseye. So, I think when we think about busy seasons, a couple things to note. How do we know if we win? Because if we don't clearly define a win, I had a thing recently where we were inviting our church to do something, and I got the results back from it, and I was disappointed. And immediately I went, hey, you never defined what a win would look like. Mm-hmm. So you set yourself up for failure because you didn't, before this ever happened, you didn't assess what result would be a win for you.
Yeah.
I think in busy seasons, clarifying wins is so crucial because it helps identify what the target is. And if you know what the target is, then you work backwards to say, well, if that's the end result we want, how do we help make that happen? Yeah. How do we resource people? How do we get our team rallied around that? And how do we, all go after it together? And listen, if we don't make it together, if we don't hit our win, we were more unified because we rallied around a goal together.
Right.
You don't lose.
Yeah.
If you don't hit your goal, you go, okay, what can we do better next time?
Yeah.
And I think that's the best thing to focus on in busy seasons. When you're in a busy season, redefine wins, clearly define what that target is, and then figure out what team unity looks like with expectations and kind of guidelines. I like to call them guardrails. Guardrails are strategically designed so that somebody doesn't go off the cliff.
Yep.
Right? Let's listen. What we do in between those guardrails, we're good. It's fair game. Not on the roads. I don't want. If you're listening to this internationally, don't think that U.S. drivers just get to do whatever they want within the guardrails. That's not true. But when I think about guardrails, I think hey, in those lanes, we can do whatever, but let's give clear, hey, here's what too far this way looks like. Here's what not far enough looks like.
Man, that's good. That's good. And as always, if you've got questions, we want them. Bring them to us. We would love to, just let you impart some more of that leadership knowledge that you've got. So with that, you got any closing thoughts for us for this week?
No, I think the big thing that I'm thinking through in this next season is it's so easy for leaders to feel alone. So one of the best things you could do today as you wrap up this podcast is just shoot a message to a leader that has been a blessing
That's good.
in your life. Shoot them a message of encouragement. Tell them how much they mean to you. Encouragement costs you nothing and means everything to the person who receives it. Hey, thanks so much for checking out this month's episode of the Selah Leaders Podcast. Darren and I are so grateful that you chose to spend some time with us today to check it out. But do us a favor, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, comment, share it with a friend, family, or another leader in your life. It would truly make a huge difference.
Yeah, and if you'd like more information, jump over to selahleaders.com.